Years before kings ruled Mesopotamia, long before empires stretched across continents, a people called the Akkadians were quietly shaping the future of civilization. Around 2500 BCE, they lived alongside the Sumerians in the fertile plains of southern Mesopotamia, building cities, farming the land, and trading across the region. They were small communities then, but the ambition and innovation they cultivated would one day change the world. By 2334 BCE, a man named Sargon of Akkad rose from humble beginnings to unite these city-states under a single rule, creating the first empire in human history. Under his leadership, and later his successors like Naram-Sin, the Akkadian Empire expanded across Mesopotamia, reaching the Mediterranean and the Arabian Peninsula, establishing trade, law, and administration that would influence civilizations for centuries. But before Sargon could rise and an empire could conquer nations, the Akkadians were still laying the foundations for what was to come. Their early communities, their culture, and their growing interactions with the Sumerians quietly set the stage for the greatest political transformation Mesopotamia had ever seen. This is the story of the early Akkadian presence, the beginnings of a civilization that would shape history itself. Before the concept of empire existed, long before kings could claim dominion over lands spanning hundreds of miles, a people known as the Akkadians were quietly shaping the future of civilization. By around 2500 BCE, Akkadian-speaking communities had established themselves along the fertile plains of southern Mesopotamia, a region bounded by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This land, both generous and unpredictable, demanded ingenuity from its inhabitants. Floodwaters could enrich fields one season and destroy them the next. Survival required careful planning, communal effort, and innovation, qualities that the Akkadians would refine over the centuries. The Akkadians lived alongside the Sumerians, the dominant culture of southern Mesopotamia, sharing trade networks, religious practices, and even writing systems. Yet, they were not merely imitators. They adopted cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script developed by the Sumerians, and adapted it to their own language. This adaptation was more than linguistic. It represented a growing cultural sophistication, a capacity for record-keeping, administration, and communication across distances that would become essential to governance in an empire. From trade agreements to temple accounts, the ability to write allowed the Akkadians to preserve knowledge and assert control in ways few others could at the time. Trade formed the lifeblood of Akkadian communities. Farmers, artisans, and merchants connected their settlements with neighboring Sumerian city-states and even more distant regions. They exported barley, wheat, dates, wool, and crafted goods, and imported copper, tin, timber, and precious stones. Through these exchanges, the Akkadians were exposed to innovations from across the Near East. They learned the importance of diplomacy, negotiation, and the strategic alliances that would later be critical when consolidating Mesopotamia under a single ruler. Even more, trade created a shared economic interest that could bind previously independent city-states together, foreshadowing the networks necessary for an empire. Daily life in early Akkadian communities was deeply intertwined with both survival and ritual. Political structures in early Akkadian settlements were varied and adaptive. Some cities were led by councils of elders or assemblies of prominent families, while others recognized a single local ruler, especially during times of conflict. Though no empire existed yet, the principles of governance, organization, delegation, and accountability were present in embryonic form. Leaders had to balance the demands of their people, coordinate labor for irrigation and construction, and defend their territories from rival communities. In doing so, they developed skills that would later be essential for unifying Mesopotamia under one authority. Conflict was never far from daily life. Skirmishes over land, water, and trade were common. Young men learned the use of simple weapons, spears, daggers, and bows, while fortifications, though modest, protected settlements from raids. Military organization remained small-scale, but experience in these conflicts honed strategic thinking, the ability to mobilize and supply forces, and the importance of loyalty and hierarchy, lessons that would serve the Akkadians well under Sargon and his successors. Over time, these experiences transformed from mere survival tactics into early military doctrine, laying the groundwork for larger campaigns and more complex armies. Innovation was not limited to governance and warfare. The Akkadians were skilled in agriculture, metallurgy, pottery, and irrigation. Religion shaped every aspect of Akkadian life. They shared many gods with the Sumerians, but began attributing distinct Akkadian characteristics and names to these deities. Worship was not just spiritual, it was political. Temples wielded influence, owned land, and employed workers, effectively acting as administrative centers. Rituals, festivals, and offerings were integral to community life, reinforcing social cohesion and the authority of leaders and priests. Through religious practice, the Akkadians internalized concepts of order, hierarchy, and divine sanction, ideas that would later legitimize kingship and imperial rule. Cultural development also advanced through language and storytelling. The Akkadians began composing hymns, myths, and proverbs in their language, preserving moral lessons, historical memories, and cultural identity. These early texts reflect an emerging consciousness of history and legacy, suggesting that the Akkadians were not only thinking about survival, but also about the enduring significance of their society. Alliances and rivalries shaped political decisions, while rivers dictated the timing of planting and harvest. This was a world both fragile and robust, chaotic yet ordered, where human ingenuity and determination created the conditions for the first empire the world had ever known. The early Akkadian presence, therefore, is not just a prelude to empire. It is a story of incremental achievement, of a people learning to organize, communicate, defend, and thrive in a demanding environment. These cities were not mere villages. They were sophisticated centers of trade, culture, religion, and politics. Yet, they were fiercely independent, often locked in rivalry with their neighbors over land, water, and resources. The political landscape was a constantly shifting web of alliances and conflicts. Kings and governors negotiated treaties for 1 year and went to war the next. Some city-states formed temporary coalitions to repel invaders, while others exploited rivalries to expand their influence. Mesopotamia's rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, were both lifelines and sources of tension. Priests controlled large tracts of land, coordinated labor, and oversaw trade and production. Offerings to the gods were meticulously recorded on clay tablets in cuneiform, documenting everything from livestock to grain to precious metals. These records were not only religious, but also a reflection of the administrative sophistication that would become crucial in unifying multiple city-states. Trade networks crisscrossed Mesopotamia. Cities exchanged grain, textiles, pottery, and crafted goods, while merchants traveled farther afield to regions rich in timber, copper, tin, and stone. These exchanges created both opportunities and rivalries. Control of trade routes could make a city wealthy, while disruption could plunge a community into famine. In this competitive environment, Akkadian communities learned early the value of diplomacy, negotiation, and strategic alliances, skills that would be vital under a centralized empire. Daily life in these city-states reflected a balance between labor, religion, and community. Farmers tended fields of barley and wheat, worked irrigation canals, and raised livestock. Artisans crafted pottery, textiles, and tools, often under the patronage of temples or local rulers. Scribes, trained from childhood, recorded everything from tax obligations to trade agreements to legal disputes. Children learned their roles within the community, whether in agriculture, crafts, or administration. Social hierarchies were evident. Kings and nobles ruled, priests guided spiritual and economic life, and common citizens labored to sustain the cities. Conflict shaped much of Mesopotamian life. Even during periods of relative peace, the threat of raiding parties or rival city-states was ever present. Armies were small but disciplined, consisting of infantry armed with spears, bows, and daggers, and occasionally chariots or wagons. Fortifications, mud brick walls, and defensive towers protected city centers, while watchtowers and outposts monitored surrounding farmland. Leaders gained prestige and authority by demonstrating military skill, winning battles, and defending trade routes. Military campaigns were not only a means of survival, but also a way to expand influence and control over resources. Cultural and religious life flourished in tandem with politics. Each city-state had its own patron deity, though many gods were shared across the region with varying names and attributes. Religious festivals, processions, and offerings reinforced social cohesion and emphasized the ruler's divine legitimacy. Temples served as venues for education, storage, and administration, making them centers of knowledge as well as worship. Music, poetry, and mythic storytelling were integral to community life, and scribes preserved these narratives in cuneiform. These cultural practices laid the foundation for a shared Mesopotamian identity, which the Akkadians would later unify under their empire. Technological advancements in these city-states were impressive. Irrigation canals, levees, and reservoirs allowed for surplus crop production, supporting growing populations. Metallurgy and pottery techniques improved, producing tools, weapons, and vessels for daily use and trade. Transportation relied on rivers and overland routes, connecting cities and enabling the exchange of goods, ideas, and innovations. Even the construction of monumental architecture, such as temples and defensive walls, demonstrated organizational skill and labor coordination that would later underpin imperial administration. Amidst this fragmented landscape, social and political tension was constant. Alliances were often temporary, based on immediate need rather than enduring loyalty. Cities competed fiercely for water rights, fertile land, and trade dominance. Rebellions and coups were common. A ruler who failed to maintain favor with priests, nobles, or citizens risked being overthrown. This instability created a paradoxical environment. Cities were vibrant centers of culture and technology, yet vulnerable to internal conflict and external threats. It is within this environment that the conditions for empire first emerged. The Akkadians, positioned among these city-states, observed both the successes and failures of their neighbors. They learned the importance of diplomacy, administration, and military readiness. They saw how trade networks could be expanded or disrupted, and how religious authority could legitimize political power. Over decades, these experiences coalesced into a strategic understanding of what it would take to unite multiple city-states under a single ruler. By 2334 BCE, the cities of Mesopotamia, though wealthy and culturally advanced, were politically fractured and vulnerable to unification. Wealth and population density provided the resources to support a larger governing authority, while continuous skirmishes and disputes revealed the need for coordinated defense and administration. In other words, the very independence of the city-states had created a situation where central authority could offer stability, security, and prosperity if wielded by the right leader. During this period, the Akkadians were poised to take advantage of these conditions. They had developed administrative skills, trade networks, military experience, and cultural sophistication. Their language, adapted to cuneiform, allowed them to communicate and record agreements, laws, and transactions. Their religious and social systems provided cohesion and legitimacy. These elements, combined with growing ambition, set the stage for a revolutionary transformation, the rise of a single ruler capable of creating the world's first empire. In imagining Mesopotamia before Sargon, one sees a dynamic, interconnected, and competitive world. Farmers worked alongside artisans, scribes documented daily life, priests maintained social order, and leaders navigated an intricate web of alliances and rivalries. The Tigris and Euphrates flowed through this landscape, enabling agriculture, trade, and travel, while also shaping political and economic decisions. Cities were vibrant yet vulnerable, sophisticated yet fragmented. In this fertile environment of competition, cooperation, and cultural exchange, the Akkadians had absorbed the lessons of centuries, preparing them for the unprecedented unification of Mesopotamia that would soon unfold. The period from 2500 to 2334 BCE in Mesopotamia is thus a story of preparation, adaptation, and potential. Each city-state's successes and failures became part of the Akkadian blueprint for governance, military organization, and cultural integration. By the time Sargon of Akkad emerged, the region was ready for centralization. The rivers, the cities, the trade routes, and the people all had been shaped by centuries of fragmented rule, waiting for a leader to transform chaos into cohesion. This was the stage upon which the first empire in human history would rise, built on the experiences, innovations, and lessons of Mesopotamia's independent city-states. By 2334 BCE, the fragmented cities of Mesopotamia had reached a point where ambition could tip the balance of history. Among the Akkadians, a man would rise who was destined to unify the region and create what the world had never seen before, the first true empire. This man was Sargon of Akkad, also known as Sargon the Great, a figure whose name would echo through millennia as a symbol of ambition, strategy, and revolutionary governance. The early life of Sargon remains shrouded in both legend and historical reconstruction, but the stories suggest humble beginnings. Some accounts, likely from later scribes and chroniclers, describe him as a cupbearer or minor official in the city of Kish, serving under a ruler of Sumerian lineage. Whether these accounts are literal or allegorical, they emphasize that Sargon did not inherit vast power or wealth. He rose through intelligence, charisma, and strategic acumen. His ascent was not preordained. It was carved through a combination of vision, opportunity, and the volatile political landscape of Mesopotamia. At this time, the Sumerian city-states were rife with instability. Leadership often shifted, rivalries were intense, and alliances could dissolve overnight. Uruk, Lagash, and Kish all wielded influence, but none had the resources, organization, or ambition to unite the region. It was precisely this vacuum of centralized authority that Sargon exploited. He understood that power required more than brute force. It required administration, communication, and the careful management of relationships with both cities and their religious institutions. Sargon's military campaigns were legendary in both ambition and execution. He first secured his position by consolidating power within Akkad and surrounding territories, ensuring that his core regions were loyal and well-supplied. From there, he launched a series of systematic campaigns to subjugate the major city-states of Sumer. Kish, often cited as his starting point, fell under his control, followed by Uruk, Lagash, and other prominent centers. He demonstrated both tactical ingenuity and psychological strategy, negotiating alliances where possible, but demonstrating overwhelming force where resistance persisted. The conquests were not merely military victories. They represented the unification of diverse city-states under a single political and administrative framework. Each conquered city retained a measure of local governance, but ultimate authority rested with Sargon. Governors, often referred to as Ensi, were appointed to administer provinces on behalf of the empire. This early model of delegated administration allowed the empire to expand rapidly without collapsing under the weight of direct, micromanaged control. Sargon recognized the value of local elites, integrating them into his administration to maintain order and continuity while reinforcing his supremacy. One of Sargon's most revolutionary moves was the establishment of Akkad as the capital city. Its exact location remains debated among historians, but it was strategically placed along the Euphrates River, providing access to trade routes, fertile land, and a defensible position. Akkad became the political, military, and cultural heart of the empire, a symbol of centralized authority that contrasted with the fragmented city-states of the surrounding region. Here, Sargon could orchestrate administration, control the distribution of resources, and project power across Mesopotamia. Trade and economic integration were central to Sargon's consolidation of power. He ensured that the empire's wealth flowed efficiently between provinces, establishing networks of roads, canals, and river routes. Surplus crops from southern Mesopotamia could support soldiers and administrators, while luxury goods and raw materials moved from distant regions to supply the needs of the capital. By linking cities economically as well as politically, Sargon reinforced loyalty and dependency, creating an empire bound by both obligation and opportunity. Sargon's reign also emphasized the power of communication and record-keeping. The Akkadian adaptation of cuneiform was employed extensively to document laws, treaties, military orders, and trade agreements. This bureaucratic sophistication allowed Sargon to govern effectively across vast distances. Messages and decrees were carried by couriers along well-maintained routes, ensuring that orders from the capital reached even remote provinces. In many ways, This network of administration and communication anticipated the logistical complexity of later empires, including those in the Mediterranean and Near East. Religion played a critical role in legitimizing Sargon's rule. In Mesopotamia, kingship was closely tied to the divine. Sargon presented himself not merely as a political ruler, but as a figure sanctioned by the gods. He participated in temple rituals, maintained alliances with priests, and portrayed himself as the protector of divine order on earth. This strategy helped to secure the loyalty of both elites and commoners, linking political authority with spiritual legitimacy. Temples, which had been centers of economic and social power, were integrated into the imperial system, reinforcing the emperor's dominance while respecting established religious structures. Despite his overwhelming power, Sargon faced ongoing challenges. Maintaining control over a vast empire required constant vigilance. Rebellions and resistance were not uncommon, particularly in cities with strong local identities. Sargon responded with a combination of military expeditions and strategic concessions, demonstrating both force and diplomacy. He deployed garrisons to key locations, reinforced trade and communication networks, and ensured that local elites were invested in the stability of his rule. This combination of tactics allowed the empire to endure and even thrive despite its unprecedented scale. Cultural integration was another hallmark of Sargon's strategy. While the Akkadian language and administration became dominant, he did not attempt to erase Sumerian culture. Instead, Sumerian traditions, literature, and religious practices were absorbed into the imperial system. This blending of cultures reinforced the legitimacy of Akkadian rule and ensured continuity, reducing the likelihood of resistance based purely on cultural identity. In this way, Sargon's empire was not only a political entity, but also a cultural network, binding together diverse populations through shared language, religion, and administration. Sargon's reign also saw advances in military organization. Armies became more structured and professional, with clear hierarchies and logistical planning. Supply lines, training, and strategic deployments allowed the Akkadian military to campaign across long distances and varied terrain, from the marshes of southern Mesopotamia to the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. These innovations made it possible to project power far beyond the reach of any previous city-state and set a standard for future empires. The consolidation of power under Sargon had long-term consequences for Mesopotamia. The concept of a single ruler commanding multiple city-states transformed political thinking. It demonstrated that centralized governance could bring stability, economic integration, and cultural cohesion to a previously fragmented region. Sargon's achievements were not limited to the battlefield. They included the creation of administrative systems, trade networks, and a cultural framework that would influence the region for centuries. By the end of his reign around 2279 BCE, Sargon had established the Akkadian Empire as the dominant power in Mesopotamia. It was an empire unprecedented in both scale and sophistication. He had unified a region that had been divided for centuries, integrated diverse populations, and created administrative, military, and economic systems capable of sustaining long-term governance. His legacy would endure, influencing later rulers and civilizations across Mesopotamia and beyond. The rise of Sargon of Akkad demonstrates that empires are not built by force alone. They require vision, organization, diplomacy, cultural understanding, and strategic communication. From modest beginnings in Akkadian communities, Sargon leveraged centuries of accumulated knowledge, experience, and social structures to transform Mesopotamia. His story is a testament to human ambition, ingenuity, and the enduring desire to create order out of chaos. Sargon's ascent also set the stage for future generations. His immediate successors, his sons Rimish and Manishtushu, would inherit not only a vast territory, but also the administrative and cultural frameworks necessary to govern it. Yet the empire would face challenges that even Sargon's genius could not entirely resolve, foreshadowing the cycles of consolidation, rebellion, and adaptation that define the history of all empires. Sargon of Akkad did not rise to power merely to conquer. He rose to rule, and his genius lay as much in administration as in warfare. From the very beginning of his reign around 2334 BCE, he understood that an empire is more than the sum of its armies. A state spanning hundreds of miles, encompassing dozens of city-states, and containing tens of thousands of people required systems for governance, communication, trade, law, and culture. Without them, conquest alone would crumble under the weight of complexity. Sargon's vision was not only to unify Mesopotamia, but also to transform it into a functioning, sustainable political, economic, and cultural organism. At the heart of Sargon's administration was a network of governors, often referred to as ensi. These officials were appointed to oversee each city or province, acting as the emperor's eyes, ears, and hands. They collected taxes, managed local labor, maintained order, and ensured loyalty to Akkad. While local rulers retained some authority, ultimate control rested with Sargon. This balance between central authority and local governance allowed the empire to remain cohesive despite its unprecedented scale. Records indicate that governors were rotated and supervised, reducing the risk of rebellion and corruption. Accountability, combined with strategic appointments, created a bureaucracy sophisticated enough to govern a diverse population stretched across plains, rivers, and mountain foothills. Communication across the empire was equally crucial. Couriers traveled along an extensive network of roads and canals, carrying clay tablets inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform. These messages included royal decrees, tax records, military orders, and trade instructions. By creating a standardized system for communication, Sargon ensured that his commands could reach even the most remote cities. This innovation allowed governors, military leaders, and traders to coordinate effectively, demonstrating a level of administrative foresight unmatched in the ancient world. Trade under Sargon's administration was both strategic and expansive. Mesopotamia was rich in grain, wool, and craft goods, but raw materials like timber, copper, tin, and precious stones had to be imported. Sargon's networks extended from the Persian Gulf to Anatolia, from the Zagros Mountains to the heart of Sumerian cities. Trade caravans moved goods overland, while rivers provided faster transport of bulk items. Markets thrived under state supervision, ensuring standardization in weights, measures, and prices. The economic integration of these regions not only enriched the empire, but also reinforced loyalty. Cities dependent on Akkadian trade had a vested interest in maintaining stability and allegiance to the central authority. One of the empire's remarkable innovations was the standardization of weights, measures, and currency equivalents. By creating uniform standards, Sargon simplified trade, taxation, and administration. Artisans could produce goods to specified dimensions, traders could assess value consistently, and tax collectors could calculate obligations accurately. This standardization fostered economic efficiency, encouraged commerce, and enhanced the credibility of the central government. It also laid a foundation for later empires, which would adopt similar methods to manage far-flung territories. Infrastructure projects were central to Sargon's economic strategy. Canals and irrigation systems were expanded and maintained under state supervision, ensuring that agriculture could support urban populations and armies alike. Roads were built or improved to facilitate troop movements, trade, and communication. Granaries and storage facilities were established to buffer against crop failures, droughts, or military needs. This attention to infrastructure was both practical and symbolic. It demonstrated the emperor's ability to command resources and improve the lives of his subjects, reinforcing his legitimacy. The empire also introduced early postal systems. Couriers transported messages swiftly between provinces, enabling real-time coordination of administration and military operations. This network functioned as the arteries of the empire, linking distant regions into a cohesive whole. In addition, standardized record-keeping in cuneiform allowed the empire to track everything from grain shipments to legal disputes, creating a transparent and auditable administrative system that reduced the risk of rebellion and inefficiency. The military organization was intertwined with the administration and economy. Soldiers were recruited from local populations and stationed strategically across the empire. Garrisons not only defended key cities, but also ensured compliance with taxation and labor requirements. Supply chains were meticulously organized, allowing armies to campaign far from their home cities while remaining provisioned. Logistics, coordination, and discipline transformed the Akkadian military into a tool that reinforced political authority, economic stability, and territorial control. Cultural and intellectual innovation thrived under Sargon's administration. By adopting and promoting the Akkadian language across the empire, he created a lingua franca that facilitated administration, trade, and cultural integration. Sumerian literary traditions were preserved, translated, or adapted, blending with Akkadian customs to produce a rich, shared culture. Temples remained centers of knowledge, education, and literacy, supporting scribes, priests, and administrators who maintained the empire's records. Through language, education, and religion, Sargon fostered a sense of identity and cohesion among diverse populations. Religion, carefully leveraged, became a tool of administration and legitimacy. Sargon portrayed himself as divinely sanctioned, a king chosen to bring order and prosperity. He participated in rituals, endowed temples, and maintained favorable relations with the priesthoods throughout the empire. This alignment of political and religious authority stabilized governance, encouraging both civic obedience and spiritual loyalty. By framing his rule as both practical and sacred, Sargon ensured that authority was respected not only out of fear, but also out of reverence and shared belief. The Akkadian economy under Sargon also emphasized labor organization. Large-scale construction projects, temples, canals, fortifications, and roads required mobilization of thousands of workers. These labor forces were coordinated efficiently, often using a combination of conscripted citizens, specialized artisans, and temporary workers. Such projects served multiple purposes. They provided employment, reinforced state authority, improved infrastructure, and symbolized the empire's power. Monuments, inscriptions, and architectural achievements communicated the reach and stability of the Akkadian state, projecting influence both internally and to neighboring regions. Innovation extended to law and governance as well. While comprehensive codifications like Hammurabi's would come later, Sargon's administration maintained records of disputes, property rights, and trade obligations. These records ensured predictability and accountability, reducing local conflicts and enhancing trust in imperial authority. Written documentation became a tool of governance, allowing officials to enforce decisions and maintain consistency across the empire. Sargon also demonstrated strategic foresight in resource allocation. He ensured that provinces contributed to both the empire's defense and prosperity. Agricultural surpluses supported urban populations and armies. Raw materials supplied artisans and builders, and trade revenue reinforced the central treasury. By linking economic productivity to imperial stability, Sargon created a feedback loop that strengthened both governance and loyalty. Provinces that prospered under Akkadian administration were more likely to support the empire, reducing the risk of rebellion and encouraging integration. Cultural integration, economic management, and administrative innovation under Sargon set a precedent for all future empires. By combining military conquest with bureaucracy, trade networks, infrastructure, standardization, and religious legitimacy, he created a system capable of sustaining vast territories and diverse populations. These innovations were not abstract concepts. They directly impacted daily life. Farmers benefited from improved irrigation, merchants from reliable markets, scribes from literacy and employment, priests from strengthened influence, and soldiers from organized logistics and protection. In every aspect, Sargon's administration transformed Mesopotamia into a coherent, functioning, and resilient empire. By the end of his reign around 2279 BCE, Sargon's innovations had solidified the Akkadian Empire as a model of administration, economy, and technological foresight. Provinces were governed efficiently, trade flourished, communication networks connected distant cities, and religious authority reinforced political control. Military organization and logistics ensured security and compliance, while cultural integration fostered identity and cohesion. The empire's systems allowed it not only to survive, but to thrive, demonstrating the enduring power of intelligent governance in human history. Sargon's administration was a demonstration of the principle that empire is more than conquest. It is the careful orchestration of people, resources, knowledge, and belief. The innovations of this period, standardized measures, provincial governors, communication networks, trade integration, labor organization, infrastructure development, and bureaucratic record-keeping, would influence Mesopotamia for centuries. Even after the empire's eventual decline, these systems provided a blueprint for subsequent rulers, including the Babylonian and Assyrian dynasties, showing the lasting impact of Sargon's governance. The death of Sargon of Akkad around 2279 BC marked a turning point in Mesopotamian history. The empire he had built from scratch was vast, stretching from the Persian Gulf through the heart of Sumer to the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. Cities that had once been independent now owed allegiance to Akkad, yet the unification he had achieved rested on fragile foundations. His immediate successors, his sons Rimish and Manishtushu, faced the immense challenge of consolidating power over an empire that, while mighty, was riddled with potential fractures. Rimish, the elder son, inherited an empire that was wealthy, culturally integrated, and militarily strong. Yet, the early years of his reign were defined by rebellion. Cities that had once accepted Sargon's authority now tested the limits of Akkadian control. Ur, Lagash, Umma, and other prominent cities rose against the central authority, attempting to reassert independence. These revolts were not mere skirmishes. They were full-scale uprisings, demonstrating that the loyalty of subjugated regions was provisional. Rimish responded with decisive military campaigns, showcasing the strategic acumen of the Akkadian army even after Sargon's death. The suppression of rebellions under Rimish was brutal but effective. Mesopotamian chronicles describe sieges, battles, and punitive measures designed to discourage further insurrection. Entire regions were sometimes brought under control through a combination of force and intimidation. Yet Rimish also recognized the importance of stabilizing conquered cities. After campaigns ended, governors were appointed, trade networks restored, and religious institutions integrated into the empire's administrative framework. This dual approach, military might tempered with pragmatic governance, ensured that rebellions were contained while preserving the economic and cultural lifelines of the empire. Military innovation continued under Rimish. He maintained the organizational structures established by Sargon, including provincial garrisons, professional armies, and logistical networks for supply and communication. Troops were strategically stationed in cities prone to rebellion, while fortified outposts monitored border regions vulnerable to external threats. The ability to move soldiers rapidly and coordinate campaigns across hundreds of miles ensured that local uprisings could be quelled before they escalated into empire-wide crises. Rimish's campaigns, though ruthless, solidified the central authority and demonstrated the resilience of Akkadian governance. Economically, Rimish faced the challenge of rebuilding regions disrupted by rebellion. Fields and irrigation systems had been neglected or damaged during conflicts, and trade networks had been interrupted. By directing resources toward reconstruction, he restored agricultural production and ensured the flow of goods essential to both urban and military populations. Granaries were replenished, markets reopened, and tribute systems reinforced, demonstrating that economic recovery was as vital as military success in maintaining imperial stability. This period highlighted the interconnected nature of administration, economy, and military power in sustaining a complex empire. Rimish's reign also reinforced cultural integration. Akkadian became increasingly standardized as the administrative language, and scribes continued to record legal, economic, and religious matters across the empire. Temples were patronized and maintained, linking spiritual authority with political control. By fostering a sense of shared identity through language, law, and ritual, Rimish strengthened loyalty and created cohesion in regions that had previously been independent or resistant to Akkadian authority. Meneshtushu, Rimish's successor, inherited an empire still recovering from rebellion but strategically intact. His reign, roughly 2275 to 2255 BCE, was marked by consolidation and expansion, though less by the dramatic campaigns of his father. Meneshtushu focused on stabilizing internal governance, overseeing infrastructure projects, and reinforcing economic networks. Roads and canals were repaired or extended, facilitating trade, communication, and military mobility. By maintaining the logistical and administrative systems established by Sargon and refined under Rimish, He ensured the continued functionality of the empire over a vast and diverse territory. Trade under Manishtushu flourished. Long-distance commerce reached Anatolia, the Persian Gulf, and beyond. Copper and tin, essential for bronze production, were imported to supply artisans and armories, while grain, textiles, and crafted goods flowed outward from Mesopotamia. Markets were regulated, weights and measures standardized, and economic documentation was maintained meticulously. The empire's prosperity depended not only on conquest, but on the smooth operation of these complex networks, and Manishtushu's attention to trade and logistics reinforced the central authority while enriching both the state and its subjects. Religion continued to be a cornerstone of legitimacy during this period. Both Rimish and Manishtushu maintained close ties with the priesthoods throughout the empire. Temples served as centers of administration, record-keeping, and education. By supporting religious institutions, the rulers reinforced their authority, aligned themselves with divine will, and integrated local elites into the governance of distant provinces. Rituals, offerings, and festivals were not merely ceremonial. They were instruments of statecraft, reinforcing obedience and communal identity. Despite relative stability under Manishtushu, the empire still faced external threats. Border regions were exposed to raids from mountain tribes or neighboring territories not yet fully integrated. Garrisons, diplomatic agreements, and strategic alliances provided a buffer, but the empire's security depended on vigilance and adaptive military organization. Manishtushu maintained the strategies established by Sargon and Rimish, ensuring that both internal and external threats were addressed efficiently, preserving the cohesion and longevity of Akkadian authority. Cultural production also thrived. Akkadian art, literature, and inscriptions continued to evolve, reflecting both imperial ideology and local traditions. Royal inscriptions celebrated victories, documented administrative reforms, and reinforced the divine authority of the kings. Artisans produced reliefs, sculptures, and ceremonial objects that communicated the power and reach of the empire. These cultural artifacts served a dual purpose. They immortalized the achievements of the rulers and visually reinforced the hierarchy, legitimacy, and cultural cohesion of Akkad throughout the empire. Administration under Rimish and Manishtushu exemplified a delicate balance, enforcing central authority while respecting local traditions, combining military power with bureaucratic oversight, and integrating economic management with cultural and religious practices. This balance allowed the empire to absorb shocks, such as rebellion or environmental stress, without immediate collapse. It also demonstrated the durability of the systems implemented by Sargon, proving that the empire could endure beyond the lifetime of its founder if carefully managed and adapted by successors. The consolidation period was a crucial test of the Akkadian model of governance. While Sargon had unified Mesopotamia through vision and conquest, Rimish and Manishtushu transformed that unity into sustainable rule. They showed that maintaining an empire required constant attention to administration, infrastructure, trade, religion, and culture. Rebellions were inevitable, but strategic responses, combining military, economic, and diplomatic tools, allowed the empire to remain intact and even prosper. Through these decades, Akkad's influence extended farther than any previous polity in the region. Its borders reached from the Persian Gulf in the south to the fringes of Anatolia and the Zagros Mountains in the north and east. Cities under Akkadian rule were linked economically, administratively, and culturally. Trade networks flourished, infrastructure improved, and shared language and religious practices reinforced loyalty. Even amidst unrest, the empire's systems ensured stability and integration across vast distances. The period from 2279 to 2255 BCE, therefore, represents more than mere continuation of Sargon's legacy. It illustrates the practical challenges of empire building and the strategies necessary to address them. Rebellions tested military organization and governance. Infrastructure projects supported economic resilience, and cultural integration reinforced legitimacy. The experiences of Rimish and Manishtushu highlight the human and administrative dimensions of empire. Rulers had to respond not only to armies and borders, but also to trade, labor, social hierarchies, and the spiritual life of their subjects. By the end of Manishtushu's reign around 2255 BCE, the Akkadian Empire had not only survived the death of its founder, but had also strengthened its foundations. Military power, administrative sophistication, economic integration, cultural cohesion, and religious legitimacy combined to create a resilient imperial system. These decades of consolidation proved that an empire could endure beyond the charisma and lifetime of a single ruler, provided that the systems of governance, economy, and social cohesion were robust and adaptable. The reigns of Rimish and Manishtushu reveal that the success of the empire is as much about management as conquest. It is about anticipating rebellion, securing loyalty, maintaining trade, overseeing infrastructure, and integrating diverse populations into a cohesive whole. Their achievements demonstrated that an empire could be maintained, expanded, and institutionalized, a lesson that would resonate throughout Mesopotamian history and influence the governance of later civilizations. Through the turbulence of rebellion and the demands of consolidation, the Akkadian Empire under Rimish and Manishtushu became more than a collection of conquered cities. It became a functioning political, economic, and cultural network capable of sustaining a centralized authority over vast distances. The foundations laid in this period enabled the empire to reach its zenith under Naram-Sin, proving that the resilience and adaptability of administration, economy, and culture were as critical to the empire as military conquest itself. By 2254 BCE, the Akkadian Empire had endured decades of consolidation and stabilization under the leadership of Sargon's successors, Rimish and Manishtushu. Yet it was under Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, that the empire would reach heights previously unimaginable. Naram-Sin's reign represents a period of extraordinary expansion, cultural flourishing, and political innovation. It was during these decades that the Akkadian Empire transformed from a powerful regional authority into an enduring symbol of imperial ambition, asserting authority not only over the Sumerian heartlands, but also across distant regions, including the Zagros Mountains, Anatolia, and beyond. Naram-Sin inherited an empire that was both formidable and complex. The administrative systems, trade networks, and military structures established by his grandfather and refined by his father provided a foundation, yet he faced the challenge of sustaining unity across a vast and diverse population. His approach combined strategic military campaigns with bold assertions of divine authority, consolidating the empire while projecting power to both internal and external audiences. Unlike his predecessors, Naram-Sin would redefine kingship itself, intertwining political and religious authority in ways that would resonate throughout Mesopotamian history. One of the most striking aspects of Naram-Sin's rule was his claim to divinity. For the first time, a Mesopotamian ruler openly declared himself a god-king during his lifetime. While earlier kings had claimed divine favor, Naram-Sin went further, portraying himself as a direct representative or embodiment of the gods on earth. This revolutionary assertion was symbolized in art, inscriptions, and monumental reliefs, which depict him towering over enemies, crowned with a horned helmet and accompanied by divine symbols. The declaration of divinity was not merely ideological. It reinforced his authority, legitimized conquest, and established a sacred dimension to his rule that discouraged rebellion and commanded obedience. Naram-Sin's military campaigns were ambitious and far-reaching. He faced both internal revolts and external threats, responding with the same combination of strategic planning and logistical sophistication that characterized his grandfather's approach. His armies marched into the Zagros Mountains, subduing mountain tribes that had resisted Akkadian authority. Campaigns extended into Anatolia, securing resources and establishing trade routes that linked the empire to distant regions. Every military operation was meticulously planned, with attention to supply lines, seasonal considerations, and terrain. Armies were coordinated across multiple fronts, demonstrating the empire's capacity for long-distance projection of power, a hallmark of imperial efficiency. The Akkadian military under Naram-Sin was not only disciplined, but also technologically and organizationally advanced. Infantry, archers, and chariots were deployed strategically, while fortified garrisons maintained order in conquered regions. The integration of local forces into the imperial army, combined with strict command hierarchies, ensured flexibility and adaptability in both offensive and defensive campaigns. Logistics and supply chains were carefully managed, allowing troops to campaign in distant territories while maintaining operational efficiency. These innovations reinforced the empire's dominance and expanded the limits of Akkadian influence. Alongside military conquest, Naram-Sin emphasized administrative sophistication. Governors, or NC, continued to oversee provinces, but the central authority was strengthened through systematic audits, tribute collection, and the monitoring of local governance. Standardized weights, measures, and currency equivalents facilitated trade and taxation, while an extensive network of roads and canals ensured communication and transportation across the empire. The combination of centralized oversight and local administration allowed Naram-Sin to maintain cohesion over a diverse and geographically dispersed population. Economic activity flourished under Naram-Sin. Trade networks linked the empire with regions rich in timber, metals, and luxury goods. Agricultural production in the fertile plains of Mesopotamia provided surplus grain to support urban centers and armies, while artisanal production in cities supplied crafted goods for both domestic use and export. Markets were carefully regulated, ensuring fair trade and standardization. Economic integration was not merely a matter of wealth. It reinforced imperial authority, making provinces dependent on Akkadian systems for their prosperity and survival. Cultural achievements under Naram-Sin were equally significant. The Akkadian language, already established as the lingua franca under Sargon and his successors, became further standardized, facilitating administration, record-keeping, and literary production across the empire. Sumerian literary traditions were preserved, translated, and adapted, creating a cultural synthesis that reflected both Akkadian authority and local heritage. Monumental art, inscriptions, and reliefs celebrated victories, religious devotion, and imperial ideology, leaving a lasting record of the empire's achievements. These cultural expressions were both celebratory and functional, reinforcing the power and legitimacy of the king while connecting diverse populations through shared symbols and narratives. Religion under Naram-Sin was inseparable from governance. Temples continued to serve as centers of both spiritual and administrative activity, linking priesthoods to imperial authority. The king's divinity reinforced the integration of political and religious spheres, ensuring that obedience to the state was both a civic and spiritual obligation. Rituals, offerings, and festivals not only honored the gods, but also communicated imperial power and reinforced communal cohesion across the empire. Through religion, Naram-Sin was able to unify diverse populations and project authority over regions that had previously resisted centralized control. Infrastructure projects flourished under his reign. Canals were maintained and extended to support agriculture and trade. Roads facilitated military movements and economic activity, and urban centers were expanded and fortified. These improvements were practical, sustaining the population and economy, but also symbolic, demonstrating the reach and organizational capacity of the empire. Granaries and storage facilities were established to buffer against famine and drought, ensuring that both cities and armies could be sustained in times of scarcity. The zenith of Naram-Sin's empire was also marked by cultural and artistic innovation. Royal inscriptions and reliefs depicted the king as a godly figure, defeating enemies and overseeing the expansion of the empire. These works conveyed not just historical events, but ideological messages, illustrating the power, legitimacy, and divine sanction of Akkadian rule. Through art, literature, and monumental architecture, Naram-Sin communicated his authority to both contemporary subjects and future generations. Despite the empire's strength, internal tensions and external pressures were ever present. Provincial governors could become ambitious, local populations sometimes resisted central control, and border regions remained vulnerable to attack. Naram-Sin's response combined military might, administrative oversight, and cultural religious integration. By maintaining a delicate balance between force, diplomacy, and ideological authority, he preserved the cohesion of an empire larger and more complex than anything previously seen in Mesopotamia. The combination of administrative efficiency, economic integration, military sophistication, and religious authority allowed Naram-Sin to push the Akkadian Empire to unprecedented heights. Under his reign, the empire was at its most unified, wealthiest, and culturally vibrant. Cities thrived, trade networks flourished, and monuments celebrated the accomplishments of both king and empire. The period of Naram-Sin's rule exemplifies the potential of centralized authority, demonstrating that political, economic, and cultural systems must work in concert to sustain a large, diverse empire. By the end of Naram-Sin's reign in 2218 BCE, the Akkadian Empire had achieved a level of power and sophistication unmatched in the ancient Near East. The assertion of divine kingship, the integration of diverse populations, and the establishment of efficient administrative, economic, and military systems created a legacy that would influence Mesopotamia for centuries. The empire's territorial reach, cultural cohesion, and political authority under Naram-Sin represent the pinnacle of Akkadian achievement, a period in which ambition, strategy, and vision converged to produce one of the world's first true superpowers. Naram-Sin's era also highlights a critical lesson in the fragility of empire. Even at the height of power, internal tensions, border pressures, and environmental factors foreshadowed future challenges. The very mechanisms that enabled expansion, centralized authority, reliance on trade, and integration of diverse populations also carried the seeds of vulnerability. While the empire under Naram-Sin was a marvel of human organization and ambition, the pressures that would later contribute to its decline were already present, hidden beneath the surface of monumental achievements and divine authority. The Akkadian Empire, rising to prominence between roughly 2334 and 2154 BCE, was more than a political and military construct. It was a crucible of culture, language, and religion that shaped the ancient Near East for centuries to come. While military conquest and administrative sophistication allowed the Akkadians to unite Mesopotamia, it was the empire's cultural foundations, its religion, art, and language, that ensured its influence endured long after its political structures collapsed. Understanding these cultural dimensions provides crucial insight into how the Akkadian Empire not only ruled, but also communicated power, identity, and ideology across a vast and diverse landscape. Religion was inseparable from daily life and governance in Akkad. The Akkadian rulers inherited a complex pantheon from the Sumerians, and rather than imposing a new belief system, they strategically merged it with their own spiritual practices. Deities like Anu, Enlil, and Inanna were integrated alongside Akkadian gods, reinforcing both continuity and imperial authority. This syncretism helped legitimize Akkadian rule. By venerating local gods and maintaining established rituals, the empire signaled respect for the traditions of conquered peoples, while simultaneously promoting the supremacy of the Akkadian kings, who were increasingly associated with divine sanction. One of the most revolutionary developments in Akkadian religion was the assertion of divine kingship, particularly under rulers such as Naram-Sin. The king was no longer merely the representative of the gods, but was declared a living god himself. Inscriptions and monumental reliefs depict Naram-Sin wearing a horned helmet, a symbol traditionally reserved for deities, as he conquers his enemies. This conflation of political and religious authority allowed the Akkadian rulers to command loyalty not just through fear or incentives, but through a sacred framework, positioning rebellion as a religious as well as political transgression. The idea that the king embodied divine will reinforced central authority and provided a shared ideological basis for a culturally diverse population. Temples served as both religious and administrative hubs, functioning as centers of learning, economic management, and record-keeping. Priests maintained cuneiform tablets documenting land ownership, trade, agricultural production, and legal disputes. Through these institutions, religion became a tool of governance. Sacred rituals, offerings, and festivals were used to reinforce the king's authority, coordinate economic activity, and foster communal cohesion. The role of the temple in Akkadian society demonstrates the intimate connection between spiritual and civic life, where devotion and administration were mutually reinforcing. Art in the Akkadian Empire was equally sophisticated and politically charged. Sculpture, reliefs, and monumental carvings celebrated imperial authority and divine favor. One of the most famous examples is the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, which depicts the king ascending a mountain, trampling his enemies, and accompanied by divine symbols. This artwork conveys multiple layers of meaning. It asserts the king's military and divine power, symbolizes the conquest of chaos by order, and communicates a shared narrative to subjects across the empire. Art became a form of propaganda, shaping perceptions of authority, legitimacy, and cultural identity. Relief panels, statues, and cylinder seals were used not only to commemorate victories, but also to standardize cultural imagery across the empire. Cylinder seals, intricately carved and rolled over clay tablets, were essential for authentication in administrative and economic transactions. These objects combined functionality with artistry, reflecting the sophisticated aesthetic and technical skill of Akkadian artisans. By embedding political and religious motifs into everyday objects, the empire reinforced its ideological presence in both elite and popular spheres, ensuring that even routine transactions carried cultural significance. The Akkadian language and writing were central to the empire's cultural cohesion. The Akkadian language, a Semitic tongue, became the lingua franca of Mesopotamia, replacing Sumerian in official, diplomatic, and commercial contexts, while Sumerian continued to exist in literary and religious traditions. Cuneiform, adapted from Sumerian script, allowed for the recording of legal codes, economic transactions, religious texts, literature, and royal inscriptions. This writing system enabled effective governance across vast distances, maintained historical memory, and facilitated the spread of cultural norms and imperial ideology. Literature flourished during the Akkadian period. Epic tales, hymns, and myths were composed or adapted in the Akkadian language, preserving earlier Sumerian stories while reflecting the values and worldview of the empire. Texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh were written or transcribed in Akkadian, blending heroic narrative, moral reflection, and religious motifs. Literature served multiple purposes. It entertained, instructed, reinforced social hierarchies, and celebrated the achievements of rulers. In doing so, it contributed to a shared cultural identity, binding the population through common stories and ideals. Religious rituals were meticulously recorded and codified. Festivals honoring gods like Enlil or Inanna punctuated the year, with offerings, feasts, and ceremonial activities involving both elites and common citizens. These rituals reinforced the sacred order of society, linking agricultural cycles, political authority, and spiritual practice. The king's participation in these events, often as both leader and divine figure, highlighted the inseparability of political power and religious legitimacy in the Akkadian world. The Akkadian Empire's artistic and literary achievements were not limited to elites. Public monuments, inscriptions, and iconography communicated ideology to a broad audience. Victory steels, temple reliefs, and city gates displayed messages of power, order, and divine favor to anyone who saw them. Even illiterate populations could interpret the symbolic meaning of images, recognizing the king's strength, divine authority, and the consequences of rebellion. Art and writing thus functioned as tools of governance, education, and cultural transmission simultaneously. Trade, diplomacy, and communication were also cultural conduits. Diplomatic letters, treaties, and correspondence with distant states were written in Akkadian cuneiform, allowing the empire to manage complex interactions with foreign powers. The use of a standardized language and script facilitated not only administration, but also the projection of cultural and political authority beyond Mesopotamia. This linguistic unification underpinned economic and political stability, enabling the Akkadian Empire to maintain cohesion across diverse territories. Innovation in artistic techniques reflected both practical needs and symbolic ambition. Bronze casting, stone carving, and relief sculpture reached new levels of sophistication. Monumental architecture, including temples and city walls, combined functional engineering with ceremonial purpose. Urban design incorporated administrative centers, religious complexes, and marketplaces, reflecting an understanding of spatial organization that linked governance, economy, and ritual. The integration of art into public life reinforced the visibility of authority, connecting everyday experience to imperial ideology. Education and literacy were central to cultural maintenance. Scribes were trained in cuneiform from a young age, mastering complex numerical, administrative, and literary systems. These scribes became essential for governance, commerce, and religious practice. Through schools attached to temples or administrative centers, knowledge of law, literature, mathematics, and ritual was transmitted to the next generation. This institutionalization of learning ensured the continuity of cultural and administrative practices across generations, contributing to the long-term stability and influence of Akkadian civilization. By merging religion, art, and language into an integrated system, the Akkadian Empire created a cultural infrastructure that reinforced political power, facilitated administration, and fostered identity across a diverse population. Religious ideology legitimized rule, art communicated power visually, and language provided the practical means for governance, trade, and historical record. Together, these elements allowed Akkad to project authority across a vast and complex empire, leaving a legacy that would shape the civilizations of Mesopotamia for centuries after the empire's decline. The interplay between religion, art, and language in Akkad also illustrates a broader principle of imperial power. Enduring influence requires cultural as well as political integration. Military conquest and administration establish control, but the transmission of ideas, symbols, and shared narratives ensures cohesion, loyalty, and identity. The Akkadian Empire's innovations in these areas became a model for subsequent empires, influencing the Babylonian, Assyrian, and later Mesopotamian polities. In essence, Akkadian religion, art, and language were instruments of empire. They conveyed ideology, maintained order, and celebrated achievement while creating a shared cultural framework for millions of people. Religious rituals linked divine authority to political power. Monumental art celebrated conquest and legitimacy. Literature and cuneiform recording preserved history, law, and cultural memory. These cultural systems were interdependent, reinforcing each other to ensure that the Akkadian Empire endured not only in territory, but also in thought, belief, and identity. Through temples, inscriptions, literature, and monumental reliefs, the Akkadians communicated authority, ambition, and vision. The empire's artistic and linguistic innovations ensured that even as political structures eventually faltered, the cultural imprint of Akkad would persist. From the crowning of kings as divine figures to the intricate artistry of cylinder seals and steels, Akkadian religion, art, and language created a civilization whose ideas and symbols resonated across generations, establishing a blueprint for the civilizations that would follow. The death of Naram-Sin around 2218 BC, it marked the end of the Akkadian Empire's golden age. Under his rule, the empire had reached unprecedented heights, combining political unity, military dominance, cultural sophistication, and divine kingship into a coherent and formidable system. Yet, even at its peak, cracks had begun to appear, cracks that would, over the subsequent decades, expand into profound challenges threatening the cohesion of one of the ancient world's first empires. These years, from 2218 to 2193 BCE, were characterized by internal struggles, regional rebellions, environmental pressures, and political fragmentation that collectively signaled the empire's early decline. Succession disputes immediately followed Naram-Sin's death. Unlike his grandfather Sargon, whose authority had been widely recognized and established, Naram-Sin's heirs faced the complex task of asserting legitimacy over a vast and culturally diverse empire. The notion of divine kingship, while reinforcing authority during his reign, became a source of contention among regional elites and competing claimants. Without a charismatic and universally acknowledged ruler, governors, city-states, and tribal regions began to test the limits of central power. In cities that had once accepted Akkadian control as both political and divine order, unrest began to emerge, often in the form of localized revolts or refusal to pay tribute. Provincial governors, or NC, who had once acted as extensions of the central authority, began asserting autonomy in response to weakened oversight. These officials managed their regions, collected taxes, and maintained military forces, but in some cases, they prioritized local interests over imperial mandates. The decentralized nature of administration, which had previously allowed the empire to function efficiently, now presented a vulnerability. When loyalty faltered, provinces could operate with a high degree of independence. Cities like Ur, Lagash, and Umma, historically centers of resistance, became focal points for early signs of rebellion, exploiting the empire's reliance on local intermediaries to challenge authority. Military pressures also began to strain the empire. Although Naram-Sin had maintained disciplined and strategically positioned armies, his successors faced difficulty in keeping garrisons loyal and adequately provisioned. The empire's extensive frontiers, reaching from the Persian Gulf to the Zagros Mountains, required constant military vigilance. With internal unrest consuming attention and resources, defending borders became more challenging. Tribes in the Zagros foothills, long subdued under Naram-Sin, seized the opportunity to raid Akkadian territories, disrupting trade and threatening the security of southern cities. These incursions, while not immediately catastrophic, highlighted the empire's growing vulnerability to both internal and external pressures. Economic stability began to waver during this period. Prolonged military campaigns, combined with political unrest, disrupted trade routes and agricultural production. Canals and irrigation systems, essential for sustaining the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, suffered from neglect or sabotage during rebellions. Crop yields fell, affecting both urban and rural populations, while famine and shortages began to test the social cohesion of Akkadian society. The empire's complex administrative and taxation systems, designed for efficiency, became increasingly difficult to maintain amid disorder, creating a feedback loop of economic and political instability. Environmental stress compounded these challenges. Archaeological and paleoenvironmental evidence indicates that the early 22nd century BC may have experienced significant droughts in Mesopotamia, reducing agricultural output and straining water management systems. Prolonged dry periods would have affected grain production, livestock, and overall food security, intensifying social discontent and weakening the central government's ability to enforce loyalty. Scarcity often led to localized conflicts, migration, and competition for resources, further destabilizing regions already experiencing political unrest. Cultural and religious authority, while once a stabilizing force, also faced challenges. The ideology of divine kingship, central to Naram-Sin's rule, was less effective under successors who lacked either charisma or widespread recognition. Without a strong central figure embodying divine authority, local populations and elites questioned the legitimacy of imperial mandates. Temples and priesthoods, previously aligned with the monarchy, sometimes supported local rulers or asserted their independence, diminishing the unifying power of religious institutions. The erosion of centralized spiritual authority further weakened the ideological cohesion that had supported Akkadian governance. Rebellion during this period took many forms. Some uprisings were urban, led by city-states attempting to regain independence from imperial control. Others were rural or tribal, involving smaller settlements and mountain tribes resisting tribute or military oversight. The empire responded with military campaigns, often brutal, aimed at suppressing dissent and reasserting central authority. However, these efforts were increasingly reactive rather than proactive. The costs of repeated campaigns, combined with logistical challenges, stretched the empire's resources and highlighted the limitations of military power when political legitimacy was in question. Administratively, the empire faced difficulties in communication and coordination. The networks of couriers, cuneiform record-keeping, and provincial oversight established under Sargon and reinforced by his successors were strained by distance, rebellion, and resource scarcity. Messages took longer to reach their destinations, orders were delayed, and governors sometimes acted independently or ignored directives. This breakdown in administrative efficiency amplified the empire's internal fragility, revealing the vulnerability of centralized control over a complex and expansive territory. Social tensions also increased during this period. Populations affected by drought, famine, or military disruption experienced hardship, leading to unrest among peasants, laborers, and urban inhabitants. Economic inequality, taxation pressures, and conscription for military or labor service contributed to dissatisfaction. Local elites, recognizing both the suffering of their constituents and the empire's weakening authority, sometimes leveraged these conditions to assert independence or negotiate favorable terms, further fragmenting imperial cohesion. Despite these challenges, the Akkadian Empire did not collapse immediately. It retained elements of central authority, military organization, and cultural identity, allowing it to function, albeit under increasing strain. Governors still collected tribute, temples still maintained records and rituals, and trade persisted along key routes, though often disrupted. The empire's institutions, while weakened, demonstrated resilience, reflecting the sophisticated administrative and economic systems that had been built over nearly a century of centralized governance. Yet the period from 2218 to 2193 BC clearly foreshadowed the empire's eventual downfall. The combination of succession disputes, rebellious governors, military strain, environmental stress, and economic disruption created an environment in which political fragmentation was inevitable. The once unified network of cities, provinces, and regions began to operate with increasing autonomy, testing the limits of imperial control. Akkad's centralized authority, which had been a source of strength, now struggled to maintain coherence in the face of multifaceted pressures. The early decline also reveals important lessons about the nature of imperial power. Even a sophisticated, well-administered, and culturally integrated empire is vulnerable when legitimacy is contested and environmental conditions deteriorate. Military might alone cannot compensate for the erosion of political cohesion, economic stability, and social trust. The Akkadian experience demonstrates that central authority depends on a delicate balance of governance, resources, culture, and ideology, and when any of these elements falters, the integrity of the state is threatened. During these decades, the seeds of future collapse were sown. Cities and provinces that had once been loyal were now semi-autonomous. External threats exploited weakened borders, economic production faltered under stress, and social cohesion was tested by scarcity and inequality. The empire's impressive infrastructure, roads, canals, granaries, and administrative networks, remained, but their maintenance was increasingly difficult. Written records from this period hint at both the attempts to restore order and the challenges that made such efforts only partially successful. Culturally, the Akkadian language, art, and religious traditions continued to provide some cohesion, but they were insufficient to overcome the combined weight of political, military, and environmental challenges. Temples still functioned as centers of ritual and administration, but their influence waned in regions where local power asserted itself. Art and literature persisted, documenting achievements and reinforcing ideology, yet they could not halt the unraveling of political authority. By 2193 BCE, the Akkadian Empire, though still formally intact, was markedly weakened. Provinces operated with significant independence, rebellions persisted, and the central government's ability to enforce order had diminished. The empire's earlier achievements in administration, trade, military organization, and cultural integration remained as a legacy, yet the structural and environmental stresses made a more profound collapse inevitable. These decades illustrate the fragility of imperial power and the complex interplay of political, social, economic, and environmental factors that can lead to the decline of even the most sophisticated civilizations. By the late 22nd century BCE, the Akkadian Empire, once the unrivaled superpower of Mesopotamia, faced a combination of political, environmental, and social pressures that would ultimately bring about its collapse. Following the death of Naram-Sin around 2218 BCE, his successors struggled to maintain the unity and authority that had allowed Akkad to dominate the region. The period between approximately 2193 and 2154 BC marks the empire's final decline, when internal fragmentation, economic instability, foreign invasions, and ecological stress converged to dismantle the once mighty state. The empire's internal weaknesses, seeded during the earlier years of succession disputes and provincial autonomy, have now fully manifested. Governors, once the king's appointed administrators, acted increasingly independently. Tribute collection became inconsistent, local armies sometimes resisted central command, and cities formerly loyal to Akkad began to assert autonomy. Uar, Lagash, and Umma cities that had a long history of rivalry, resisted central authority whenever imperial attention weakened. The empire's administrative framework, which had allowed Sargon, Rimish, Manishtushu, and Naram-Sin to govern vast distances effectively, could no longer maintain cohesion in the face of widespread disorder. Economic decline exacerbated political instability. Agriculture, the backbone of Mesopotamian prosperity, suffered from disrupted irrigation systems, neglect of canals, and environmental stress. Famine and shortages affected both urban and rural populations, intensifying dissatisfaction. Trade networks, once carefully managed and expansive, faltered as local authorities prioritized their own regions over imperial coordination. The disruption of commerce further weakened the ability of the central government to mobilize resources, fund armies, and maintain infrastructure. Economic stress and political fragmentation thus created a cycle in which each problem reinforced the other, gradually eroding the foundations of Akkadian rule. Environmental challenges played a critical role in the empire's fall. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests that the Akkadian heartland experienced prolonged droughts during this period. Reduced rainfall affected crop yields, led to the desiccation of key water sources, and placed enormous stress on both human populations and livestock. Famine, malnutrition, and social unrest were natural consequences of these ecological pressures. Communities dependent on irrigation faced unprecedented difficulties in maintaining food production, and the empire's centralized systems were increasingly unable to respond effectively. The interaction of environmental stress with pre-existing political fragility created conditions in which collapse became increasingly likely. External threats accelerated the empire's decline. The Gutians, a group from the Zagros Mountains to the east, exploited the weakened state of Akkad. These mountain tribes, previously subdued or peripheral, launched raids and invasions that destabilized Mesopotamian cities. The Gutians' incursions disrupted trade, destroyed settlements, and challenged the empire's military capabilities. Unlike the disciplined and strategically organized armies of earlier Akkadian rulers, the empire's forces were now overstretched, poorly provisioned, and weakened by internal rebellions. The Gutian invasions, while not immediately successful in conquering all of Akkad, exposed the empire's vulnerability and created a climate of insecurity across the region. Military campaigns against both internal and external threats were increasingly reactive and less effective. The empire, which once projected power across Anatolia, the Zagros, and the Persian Gulf, was now primarily concerned with defense. Garrisoned armies struggled to contain uprisings and repel raiders simultaneously. In some regions, local commanders negotiated with invaders rather than resisting, reflecting both desperation and the diminishing authority of the central government. This combination of weakened military capacity, fragmented loyalty, and multiple fronts created a situation in which the empire could no longer function as a unified, centralized authority. Social disintegration accompanied these political and military failures. Urban populations, affected by famine and disrupted economic activity, grew restless. Laborers and peasants, already burdened by taxation and military conscription, experienced hardship that undermined loyalty to the central state. The redistribution of resources became inconsistent, and local elites increasingly prioritized survival over allegiance to Akkad. These social pressures contributed to unrest, rebellion, and the eventual abandonment of cities. As urban centers became less secure and less prosperous, the empire's cultural and administrative cohesion weakened further. Religious institutions, which had been key to legitimizing authority, were no longer able to maintain the unifying influence of the past. Temples remained centers of ritual and record-keeping, but their allegiance was increasingly local rather than imperial. Priests and religious leaders, who had once reinforced central authority through ritual and ideological support, often aligned with regional powers. The divine kingship model, pioneered by Naram-Sin, had lost effectiveness under weak successors. Without a universally recognized divine figure to unite the population, ideological cohesion faltered, leaving the empire vulnerable to political and military disintegration. Despite these challenges, the empire did not collapse overnight. Akkad retained some measure of central authority, with certain provinces still paying tribute and administrative networks functioning in limited capacities. Trade continued along certain routes, albeit at reduced levels, and cultural practices, language, writing, and religious observances remained in circulation. These remnants highlight the sophistication of the empire's institutions and the resilience of its cultural foundations, which persisted even as political power waned. The final years of the Akkadian Empire saw the Gutians gradually assert dominance over large swathes of Mesopotamia. By the mid-22nd century BCE, Akkadian authority was largely nominal outside the core southern cities. Some regions retained allegiance to local Akkadian kings or governors, but centralized control had effectively ended. The empire's collapse was marked not by a single catastrophic event, but by a series of compounded crises: political fragmentation, economic disruption, environmental stress, military pressure, and social unrest, each amplifying the effects of the others. Archaeological evidence confirms widespread urban decline during this period. Cities that had been centers of administration, trade, and culture were partially or completely abandoned. Monumental architecture fell into disrepair, administrative records ceased in many areas, and long-distance trade diminished. The physical landscape of Akkad mirrored the political reality. Once vibrant urban centers and cultivated plains became increasingly neglected, illustrating the profound impact of compounded crises on a complex society. Yet, even in collapse, the legacy of the Akkadian Empire endured. The language, administrative innovations, art, and cultural models established by the Akkadians influenced successive civilizations in Mesopotamia. Babylonian, Assyrian, and later Mesopotamian polities adopted Akkadian cuneiform as a standard script, employed similar bureaucratic structures, and drew inspiration from Akkadian legal, economic, and cultural precedents. In this sense, the fall of the empire was not an absolute erasure but a transformation, where its achievements persisted and shaped the development of the ancient Near East for centuries. The fall of Akkad between 2193 and 2154 BCE is thus a case study in the vulnerabilities of early empires. Despite sophisticated administration, strong military systems, integrated culture, and ideological cohesion, external pressures, environmental stress, and internal fragmentation proved insurmountable over time. The Gutian invasions, combined with famine, drought, rebellion, and administrative decay, dismantled an empire that had once represented the pinnacle of human organization, ambition, and cultural synthesis. By 2154 BCE, centralized authority had effectively vanished. The once mighty cities of Akkad and its surrounding territories no longer recognized a unifying king, and local rulers, tribal groups, and foreign powers filled the vacuum. The empire's political structures were gone, but its cultural and institutional innovations endured, influencing law, governance, language, and art throughout the region. The fall of Akkad illustrates that even the most advanced and centralized civilizations are subject to the forces of nature, human ambition, and the fragility of political systems. Understanding Akkad's contributions provides insight not only into the mechanisms of early empires, but also into how human ambition, creativity, and vulnerability intersect in the story of civilization. The most immediate and lasting contribution of Akkad was its political and administrative model. Sargon's unification of Sumerian city-states demonstrated the possibility of centralized rule over a diverse and geographically dispersed population. By appointing governors, known as NC, to oversee provinces, establishing standardized laws, and implementing systems for tribute collection and resource management, the Akkadian Empire set a blueprint for governance that influenced subsequent Mesopotamian empires, including the Babylonians and Assyrians. This model combined central authority with localized administration, allowing for efficiency while accommodating regional differences, a lesson in the balance between control and flexibility that resonates in political systems even today. The empire's innovations in communication, record-keeping, and bureaucracy were equally transformative. The use of Akkadian cuneiform across the empire enabled accurate administration over vast territories. Economic transactions, legal matters, military logistics, and religious records were all documented on clay tablets, creating an enduring archive of human activity. Standardized weights, measures, and accounting methods facilitated commerce and taxation, while postal systems and courier networks allowed orders and messages to traverse great distances. These administrative achievements were not just practical, they were foundational, ensuring that centralized authority could operate effectively over diverse populations and challenging terrains. Culturally, the Akkadian Empire advanced the integration of religion, language, and art as instruments of cohesion and ideology. The assertion of divine kingship under Naram-Sin, combined with the integration of Sumerian and Akkadian religious traditions, provided both ideological and political legitimacy. Language was another cornerstone of Akkad's enduring influence. Akkadian, a Semitic tongue, became the lingua franca of Mesopotamia, gradually replacing Sumerian in official and diplomatic contexts, while Sumerian persisted in religious and literary traditions. The widespread adoption of Akkadian cuneiform allowed for consistent administration, legal documentation, and cultural transmission. Long after the empire's collapse, Akkadian remained the written language of diplomacy, administration, and literature in Mesopotamia for centuries, demonstrating the empire's profound and lasting impact on communication and literacy in the region. Economically, the empire's policies and systems reshaped trade and resource distribution. By linking distant regions, from the Persian Gulf to Anatolia and the Zagros Mountains, through trade networks and standardized commerce, Akkad facilitated the flow of metals, timber, grain, and luxury goods. Fortified garrisons, mobile forces, and logistical management enabled sustained campaigns and rapid responses to rebellion or invasion. While these military achievements could not prevent eventual collapse, they established models for organizing equipping, and maintaining large forces, influencing subsequent Mesopotamian powers and demonstrating the critical role of military organization in sustaining imperial authority. Art and monumental architecture were not only aesthetic expressions, but also instruments of ideology. Reliefs, sculptures, steles, and urban design conveyed messages of power, legitimacy, and divine favor. Cities like Akkad, Ur, and Nippur were not merely administrative centers. They were cultural symbols, representing the empire's reach and authority. Cylinder seals, intricately carved and used for legal and commercial purposes, combined artistry with practical function, illustrating how art could permeate daily life while reinforcing social and political structures. These cultural achievements left a visual and material legacy that continued to inform Mesopotamian art, architecture, and urban planning long after the empire's decline. Despite its achievements, the Akkadian Empire also offers lessons in the fragility of human systems. Environmental stress, including droughts that affected agricultural production, compounded internal political instability and contributed to societal vulnerability. Succession disputes, rebellions, and provincial autonomy weakened central authority, while external pressures, such as Gutian invasions, exploited the empire's vulnerabilities. The rise and fall of Akkad illustrate that even highly organized, culturally integrated, and militarily powerful civilizations are subject to forces beyond human control, including environmental and social factors. This underscores the complex interplay of ambition, governance, natural conditions, and human behavior in shaping the fate of civilizations. Furthermore, the empire demonstrates the importance of cultural resilience in the face of political collapse. While centralized authority disintegrated by 2154 BCE, the Akkadian language, art, religious traditions, administrative practices, and literary culture persisted. Later Mesopotamian civilizations, including Babylonia and Assyria, drew directly on Akkadian models for governance, record-keeping, law, literature, and imperial ideology. In this sense, the collapse of the Akkadian Empire did not erase its influence. Rather, it transformed it, embedding lessons, practices, and symbols into the collective memory and institutional frameworks of successive societies. The story of Akkad also illustrates the dynamics of imperial ambition and human ingenuity. From modest communities around 2500 BCE, Akkadian-speaking populations created an empire that stretched across hundreds of kilometers of the Mesopotamian plains and mountains. Through strategic governance, military skill, economic integration, and cultural innovation, they achieved what had never been done before, unifying diverse city-states under a single, centralized authority while projecting power, ideology, and culture across a broad and heterogeneous territory. This achievement demonstrates both the potential and limits of human organization, revealing the capabilities and vulnerabilities inherent in early empires. In education and knowledge transmission, Akkad's legacy is equally profound. The scribal schools, training generations of administrators, clerks, and scholars in cuneiform and record-keeping, ensured continuity of administrative and cultural knowledge. The documentation of legal codes, trade agreements, religious texts, and literary works preserved institutional memory, allowing subsequent empires to learn from Akkadian models. By institutionalizing education and literacy, Akkad created mechanisms for cultural and administrative continuity, ensuring that its innovations endured far beyond the life of the political state. Ultimately, the legacy of the Akkadian Empire is multidimensional. Politically, it demonstrated the possibilities and challenges of centralized rule over a vast, diverse territory. Economically, it integrated trade, resource management, and administrative oversight to sustain complex societies. Militarily, it showcased organized campaigns, garrison systems, and strategic planning. Culturally, it fused language, religion, art, and literature to create a shared identity and enduring influence. Environmentally, it highlighted the vulnerability of even sophisticated systems to ecological pressures. In all these dimensions, Akkad offers lessons for understanding the mechanisms of statecraft, the limits of human control, and the enduring impact of cultural innovation. The enduring significance of Akkad lies not only in its historical achievements, but also in its ability to shape human imagination and memory. Through cuneiform tablets, monumental art, and literary records, the empire communicated its vision, ideology, and accomplishments to future generations. Successive civilizations in Mesopotamia and beyond drew upon these precedents, demonstrating the empire's lasting influence on governance, culture, and thought. In this sense, Akkad transcends its temporal existence, serving as both a historical case study and a symbol of human ambition, creativity, and the delicate balance between order and fragility. The story of Akkad, from its early communities around 2500 BCE to its collapse by 2154 BCE, is a testament to the possibilities and limits of civilization. Its innovations in governance, administration, military strategy, culture, language, and religion established models that shaped the ancient Near East for centuries. At the same time, its decline underscores the vulnerability of even the most sophisticated systems to the interplay of political, social, economic, and environmental pressures. The empire's legacy, preserved in language, art, literature, and administrative structures, demonstrates the enduring power of ideas and institutions, even when political authority fails. Through the lens of Akkad, we understand that the rise and fall of civilizations is rarely the result of a single factor. Instead, it reflects complex interactions between human ambition, environmental constraints, social organization, and cultural systems. The Akkadian Empire exemplifies the height of early imperial achievement, the consequences of overextension, and the lasting influence of cultural and administrative innovation. Its story continues to resonate across millennia, providing lessons not only for historians, but for anyone seeking to understand the dynamics of power, culture, and human endeavor.